when they talk about applying AI for more effective customer experiences, a lot of times what they're really describing, what they're really talking about is personalization.
And so it just ends up repeating the same pathologies, but in a fancier way.
Welcome to Real Story on MarTech. Ruthless advocates for your MarTech mission. Advising buyers with just the facts on stacks to get you on the right track.
All right, welcome back to the Real Story on MarTech. I'm Jarrod Gingras, Managing Director of the Real Story Group.
And I'm Tony Byrne, founder of Real Story Group.
Okay, Tony, today we're going to be talking about a very topical topic once again, and this is AI and the future of personalization.
Yeah, two great buzzwords for the price of one.
Yeah, I think in some of the past episodes we've talked a fair bit about AI, of course, and we've touched on the topic of personalization quite a bit of times too, but now we're going to put them together.
Like peanut butter and jelly.
All right, well, let's start with some baselining here. Let's rewind the clock a little bit back to early 2023. So, Tony, from your perspective, where did we get to from a MarTech perspective, specifically on personalization, before we had that big ChatGPT supernova?
Yeah, it's so fascinating because, as you know, digital marketing leaders have been trying to personalize experiences online really for the past 30 years now, right? Like, it's not a new topic. It's not a new ambition since the dawn of the web and for that matter, even going back to AOL and so forth. Marketing leaders have always wanted to personalize at some level. And ironically, even after all that time, as we got to 2020 and the pandemic and everything, the results from personalization haven't always really been that great, unless you're like Amazon or Netflix and you have billions, to spend on it.
Yeah, it's almost like we all know what we need to do, and it seems like it should work. But in our experience here at Real Story Group, I can say the majority of personalization projects don't make it past the pilot phase, right? And that's due to a multitude of issues, but maybe that's feasibility issues or straight up ROI failures. But we're seeing that, you might show some good results, but if it wasn't feasible at scale, it might not be worth the cost required to keep this thing up and running.
Yeah, the cost thing is really interesting, and it's a topic that isn't, I don't think, discussed enough. And it relates, I think, to preparedness, right? Like, you really need to have your stuff together to do personalization. Your data house needs to be in order. You need to have the right rule set, or more generally, the right logic, right, for the environment you're in. How are you going to personalize? And then execute on that. And it really then turns around and magnifies all your reporting difficulties, because now you have to analyze a much more complicated interaction environment. And then, as you know, there's the whole content challenge, which has always been a bottleneck, I feel like, for personalization.
Yeah, well, let's explore that topic of the content bottleneck, or sometimes I call it content gap. And I talk about this a lot when I'm speaking to DAM specific audiences, those are the content people in the room mostly. And I'm always talking about it's that bottleneck or that gap as it relates to content that appears at the last minute that is ultimately the killer of these personalization projects. Tony, you know that we've worked with this big hospitality brand in the past, and I'm sure all of our listeners can relate to being part of a loyalty program at a big hotel chain or hospitality brand, and even getting beyond just the notion of personalization or hyper personalization. Let's just play this out in terms of segments, like broad segments. So we're all part of these loyalty programs. They slot us into a bucket, whether it's the top tier, mid tier, low tier, or something else completely. So you have content that caters to each of these tiers, but then you have content that's catering to different brands of hotels that you might be staying with. So now I'm getting something targeted to me at a high tier for this brand, but then something we might want a variant for this region of the world, for this region of the country in that region of the world. Maybe you want some variant for this time of year or for this interaction life cycle. Maybe I want something different when I'm booking my hotel room versus when I'm checking in versus when I'm checking out. And we need to translate everything too. So if you think about it from a segment perspective and how much content we need to feed that beast, it's exponential.
Yeah, totally. And so what we've tended to see instead is kind of big bucket segmentation, right? Put you in a really big class of customers and then target against that segment, which isn't a bad thing, right? Like we always say, it's good to start there, but it's not at the same time really delivering on this promise of more fine-grained targeting, let alone getting down to like, one-to-one engagement.
Yeah, and even that big bucket segmentation, that's not easy either. That's why I want to be clear to everyone here. So you might default to segmentation over personalization, but no one's, or very few, are really doing that well. So the thing of it is here, Tony, is that MarTech vendors have always known that this is a hot topic. This is what buyers, want, and in some ways it's kind of a holy grail for many marketers, right? That singular experience catering to the right person at the right time in the right place, right? And the vendors that we've watched for many years, they all say they can do it. But I can say that of all the things that we track at Real Story Group, personalization has got to be one of the most siloed topics that we try to chart.
Totally. And this drives enterprise architects crazy because the state of the market really up until recently, and even to a large extent now, has been that vendors inject personalization as features within their little domain, right? Even like mega vendors that have, these so-called suite vendors that have multiple different platforms, they typically treat personalization as a feature within a particular channel or within a particular domain. And so if we're looking at this from technically, like where's the market put personalization? Is it that they put it within, your advertising platform, within your website platform, within your email platform, within your storefront, within your marketing automation, within loyalty, as you mentioned, e-commerce and so on and so forth. Each, with their own little personalization subsystem, and we'll get into that in a minute, but the what ends up happening is that what the vendors lay out for you is personalization as a very localized feature and not really a strategy, let alone a comprehensive service.
Yeah, you're getting sold a whole bunch of features within a very specific channel, but what all our clients want, from the buyer side, they want omni-channel personalization, right? They don't want it to just be within that single channel. They want it to be at every single touch point. So that's a big disconnect, certainly.
Yeah.
I also think that we've tended to see personalization initiatives more as a project rather than a program, right? And this gets back to where we talk about these things need care and feeding over time. It's not something that's just one and done. You need to implement these things tactically, and we don't always see a lot of learning cycles going into this and, getting better over time. To be fair, we've seen some exceptions, and I think where we've really seen some of our legacy clients struggle is, when our clients come from kind of more traditional backgrounds and they try to change the way they're working to all of a sudden start personalizing, versus where we've seen some of the biggest successes of our clients are those that are kind of born digital. You mentioned I guess the Amazon and Netflix weren't necessarily born digital, but for all intents and purposes, they were, right? Yeah. They were recreated companies that were in a very, very much digital way. But we've seen some other, smaller names than the Amazon and Netflix of the world that were truly born digital, and their personalization programs are literally baked into their DNA, right? And so they have these large data science teams who just work on that. This isn't a side job. This isn't that project that we mentioned. This is truly part of that DNA. And even those sometimes struggle to execute across multiple channels, and certainly in an omni-channel way.
Yeah, and we've worked with some, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I think before we do that, maybe, we could just talk about, we've been complaining a little bit, hopefully not whining, but complaining, and it's really complaining on behalf of you, the MarTech leader, right? Like we're sort of reflecting, I think, some of the personalization struggles that have been, indicating to us over the past, 30 years or so. But on a more optimistic note, before, we move on here to the bigger topic is, let's talk about what an idealized personalization architecture would look like in a kind of just a generic way, right? And like everything else, it's an architectural question, and so we need to think in terms of layer. In an idealized world, we would have source content variants, source data, both very accessible, both very relevant. And then some governed business logic that then provides some direction to all of this. And then ideally some orchestration where you orchestrate against objectives, against priorities, certainly against channels and context, so that then when you execute in channel, is then at the top or fourth level of that is the execution. You can execute in channel, but you can say, look, I'm going to hold off on sending this email message and I'm instead going to do something else. Or I'm going to make sure that I present, the same cross-sell opportunity on the website that I just sent, via WhatsApp and have, some orchestration that then delivers this in channel across your channels. And this is, obviously going to be a lot more important going forward. But, as you mentioned, that's not the world for the most part that we live in today. That's not the architecture that that most enterprises have been able to build. There's a lot of reasons for that, but the result is that we, as customers, we often end up having really disjointed experiences. That I have my emails personalized one way, websites personalized the other way, so on and so forth, and we haven't really had sort of an out of the box, customer personalization engine. It kind of doesn't exist because it's really, to a large extent, an architectural challenge.
All right, Tony, let's shift gears here just slightly. So let's do a little quick quiz. What term have we avoided talking about today?
And that would be AI, Jarrod. So let's talk about that now.
Yeah, let's get back to the true title of our podcast today, how AI changes the personalization game. And, as we were talking so far, I couldn't help but notice the similarities and sometimes how we talk about personalization versus how we've been talking about AI the last few years, and how like personalization, AI has been implemented and rolled out by many vendors as a feature of their product and not necessarily seen the big picture. So there's definitely similarities there. Likewise, people are thinking about it as AI as projects, not programs, and certainly some similarities there. But I think what's really interesting to know, in today's market, today's buyers, what buyers are looking for, that, even though the vendors are not saying it out loud, when they talk about applying AI for more effective customer experiences, a lot of times what they're really describing, what they're really talking about is personalization. And in particular, personalization and targeting that right person at the right time at scale. That's what they're talking about. So we're not talking about workflow efficiency, which is definitely useful, but the high value picture that you're seeing painted here from the vendors in particular are things like marketing agents, generating personalized experiences in a very real-time manner.
Right. Or even on the other side of the coin, you mentioned kind of internal workflow efficiency, which is a legit AI use case. A lot of times that efficiency kind of revolves around being able to generate all these different variants and all this different logic, all coordinated and with the right codes and so forth, so that you can personalize. So a lot of AI, is a personalization story, and it's an attractive one, and it's part of this sandwich that we see a lot of MarTech leaders in today, where their executive leadership is coming to them and saying, why aren't we using AI to do one-to-one personalization? And then that's the kind of sandwich from the top, and then below you've got all of these different kind of siloed sort of prototypes that aren't necessarily getting you there. And so a lot of MarTech leaders feel sandwiched around AI, and a lot of that is, I think, we still have this kind of personalization gap that we have there. And once again, I think it's really important to look at this, from an architectural perspective.
Yeah. So let's look at what's happening across the board here. And it seems that, every vendor that we see is adding AI and agent enabling to their own legacy code bases. And so when our clients come to us, at least today, and as we sit here in 2026, when they ask us, where does AI live in our stack, or where should AI live within our stack? Well, the reality today is AI is everywhere, right? It's embedded in every single application and platform that exists within your organization. So, but where should it live is kind of the bigger question.
Yeah. And we'll definitely get to that. But I think, it's just this incredible, history repeating itself, where vendors are injecting AI as a feature in specific channels. And let's admit, on the one hand, this is so attractive to an enterprise customer. On one hand, in other words, you just like, hey, it's there, I can just light it up. But on the other hand, it really reinforces this 2010s architectural model of putting a lot of intelligence and capabilities and jamming it into a very limited kind of channel or silo context. And so it just ends up repeating the same pathologies, but in a fancier way.
So that's the real story about where we're at today. But it really begs the question about what are we going to do about this? What should our clients do about it? What should you, the listener, do about it? So let's get into that next. But first, Tony, let's take a break and hear a word from our sponsor. Dear listeners, did you know that 16 of the Fortune 20 enterprises have turned to Real Story Group over the years for MarTech advice, either to guide them through an important technology selection or help steer them and their stack in the right direction?
That's right, Jarrod. But our Real Story Group corporate members come in many sizes, including some really digitally focused mid-sized firms like you mentioned earlier. The key thing that all of our clients share is a desire to take their MarTech stack, their AI strategies, and critically, their own professional careers to take it really to the next level. So to explore further, find us at realstorygroup.com.
Okay, Tony, so everyone out there is listening and asking themselves, I get it, you're painting the real story about AI, and that's good, but what do I need to do things better? What do I need to succeed in my organization?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because two things. First, architecture, again, is really going to be critical to your success. And secondly, you really need to take a layered approach. And more enterprises that have been doing sort of personalization-centric AI sort of experiments and prototyping, they're beginning to understand this. It's just that they're not always intentional in the way that they then go about kind of, changing to actually be able to be successful. And so I think if you are intentional, what does this look like? And once again, we would turn, to layers. Is that, ideally you have some sort of shared orchestration layer or control plane that you control, where you've got all the things that I think we know now you need for successful AI and agents, but are particularly important when we're talking about sensitive issues of personalizing a customer experience. So you need some planning and arbitration. You need to have policies and eligibility, obviously identity and permissions, context package, which we all know is huge. And then really critically, audit and observability, right? Because you need to know, why did someone get something when they got it? And then underneath that, some sort of context layer, which we'll talk about later, and then being able to orchestrate this across your channels. So a personalization strategy, definitely in the future, you want it to be AI inflected, but that really depends on having the right AI architecture. And that starts with a control plane that includes a context layer and that can feed some sort of, orchestration layer. So I know that's an abstract discussion, but many of you are feeling your way there, and I think being more intentional about it is going to make you more successful and probably get to value faster.
It certainly is an abstract conversation, but we've been working hard at Real Story Group to document kind of the patterns that we're seeing. So we have a number of diagrams and reference architectures that are emerging. So if you're a client listening to this, feel free to reach out and we'll walk you through what we have so far. And we're learning every day. But what's been really interesting is watching and helping large enterprises figure this out, and particularly figure out what this means from a practical standpoint.
Yeah, and as a practical standpoint, I mean, it's okay to experiment. We understand that many of you are in kind of pilot mode, and I think particularly in agentic, you can learn a lot. And I think that, let's just start with one of the big takeaways, which is that it's really critical to have a context layer. Without that context layer, you're just not going to get personalization right. And there's a lot of pieces to that context layer, but it really kind of starts, it starts there.
So this conversation really reminds me of a case study that we heard loud and clear from one of our clients on our MarTech Leadership Council. This one in particular is a Fortune 50 enterprise that kind of fell into a high tech category, we'll call it. And they told us about how they were really struggling when piloting AI agents to provide automated reports and insight from customer interaction data, right? And the specific example they gave was how the agents would confuse metrics that had similar names but different definitions. They made confident assertions based on numbers that were, in some cases, 3 months or more stale, right? So they couldn't recognize what something like current year meant. Was this financial year? Was this calendar year? Or was it something completely else? It's completely different. So the team's initial instinct in this example was to fix the prompts by making them more comprehensive. They added more instructions, more guardrails, more examples, and it helped a little bit, right? They saw some benefits, but not enough to restore the trust of their users. So what they ultimately did is they undertook some detailed work to provide accurate definitions and descriptions of pivotal tables and fields in the data store. They documented what each and every field meant. They tagged when the data was last updated. They specified which source was authoritative when multiple systems had the same metric. And over time, this iterative process of continual enrichment, they're seeing some real dramatically improved in some cases results. And that just goes to show that the models that exist today, particularly these large language models, they require context and related engineering to be effective. You're not just going to get it out of the box on day one.
Yeah, and it's such a meaningful story in so many dimensions because although this was really about efficiency, it was a precondition for doing a lot of personalization because they needed to improve their predictive models, and to do that, they needed much better insights coming out of it. And secondly, they needed to learn how to do this right, because it's one thing to be making mistakes in terms of your internal reporting. You can't make those same mistakes when you're interacting with the customer, right? And so this was really kind of some foundational lessons. The other really interesting thing about that, Jarrod, is that they didn't need to add more technology to their stack to do this.
Right.
They basically, the content layer was really around a lot of content analysis and engineering and a lot of governance and decisioning and using the tools they had, more effectively to build that context layer. But what's so interesting about this is that, they did this in a particular environment, and it was around some data science that they wanted to do. And we've been working with other clients who are doing similar things, building context layers kind of one at a time, and realizing that they need to do this in a more centralized way. In other words, to have a shared context layer. And this is particularly important right now because what we're seeing in the evolution of some of these sort of vendor-driven prototypes is that the vendors are saying, okay, so you didn't like the results the first time. What you need to do is to do just what this Fortune 50 firm does, is feed us more context, feed us more context, feed us more context. And you end up building a context layer once again within that vendor's, particular silo. And so that's not going to scale, and it's not going to work very well for you, and it's going to lead to a lot of messy customer experiences as opposed to this kind of beautiful targeted personalization that they want. And so you really don't want to be doing this 6 times. I mean, you really want to have a shared context layer, ideally centralized. There's pieces to that. The semantic layer, which we heard about, certainly with that case study you just talked about, there's states layer, what's going on right now. A policy layer, which is going to be really important for personalization, and then governance, which I thought that firm did a really good job of sort of saying this is authoritative, this is not. Again, really critical. So there's pieces to a context layer. It's not just one big blob, but you definitely want to handle that centrally. So the key question then to ask of any personalization execution environment is, how will you tap our shared context layer as opposed to how, don't make us rebuild that within your particular silo.
Yeah. And, this isn't the first technology where we have the conversation of should this be centralized or decentralized. And, whenever we land on centralization sounds scary to people, right? And, but I think when it comes to personalization in the context of AI, it's critical to realize that in the long run, the real value about personalization is actually in the loop, right? And you want to own the loop because that's where the ROI is going to live.
Yeah, and when we say the loop, we're really talking about kind of a decision loop right here, where you have insights AI that kind of tells you, what you know and what you need to do, and then decisioning AI, it makes choices and directs you in terms of doing that, and then ideally, generative AI is actually downstream from there. So you don't want to start with Gen AI. Generative AI should be downstream from the insights and the decisioning, saying basically generate or assemble the right interaction. And then there should be some learning loop back to the insights AI. And that learning loop is really critical because that's often where the value is. Because the first time you do this, you may or may not see, much lift from your personalization, but it's the real ROI comes with the constant, refinement and experimentation. And you definitely want to own that loop. We had this conversation just in one of our previous episodes about working with agencies and agencies wanting to own the loop. And you definitely don't want that. You want to own it. When we talk about ownership, of course, it's important to recognize here, and many of you listening in are probably already thinking, wow, this has pretty profound organizational and staffing implications, right? We're talking about shifting resources, potentially new roles whenever you're going to centralize. And, it does remind me of another case study that we worked with. This was, again, a born digital retailer. They were spending a lot with a legacy email service provider or email service platform that was important. They had a daily newsletter that went out that drove a lot of their volume for that day. There was a lot of things you can associate with a legacy email service provider, a lot of clunkiness. It was expensive, difficulty creating the kind of highly targeted personalized messaging without pumping a lot of services into this complex platform. And so it was not just overkill, but also kind of an inhibitor. And so we helped them work through a transition to more of a programmatic or transactional email platform that was 1/8 the cost. And what they did was redeploy those services back to the back end. In terms of creating, a database of pre-baked email components, and then really investing in data science to constantly improve the algorithms about what gets set and how it works. And then they were able to then deploy those algorithms to other execution environments like the commerce environments and the website and so forth. And so they ended up getting a 20% improvement in interaction and messaging delivering revenue, over time. It took some cycles. So there's a couple of lessons out of this. One is, of course, the importance of data science in doing this kind of insights work that's so critical. But the other thing was, they took the savings from downshifting to a more transactional provider, and they put it into data science and into judgments, into the centralized platform about what customers would really want to interact with. The other story that's kind of hidden in there, but is obviously very important when it comes to personalization that we should cycle back to is, once again, Jarrod, the primacy of content, and for them having really structured content components that they could mix and match appropriately.
Yeah, let's talk about content for a bit, because we've hit on this many times on this podcast. It's sort of a running theme throughout this, the importance of data, as you talked about, but you can't trivialize the importance of having your content house in order. And, when I talk about digital asset management and the evolution of digital asset management, we talk about this goal of DAM 4.0 in the future, where your content is structured in just the right way to get that right content to the right person at the right time. None of that happens unless you have the basic building blocks of content in place. The right metadata, the right taxonomies, the right granularity of storage, and all these different things in place to do that. You can't do any of what our clients are looking at as their North Star without this basic building blocks in place, and that just shines a light on these same issues when we talk about it from a personalization standpoint. So, how ready are you for personalization? Yeah, you got to know your customer, but you also have to know your content and make sure it's ready to give them what they need to make them take the action that you want them to take. Let's take a moment and go back to that example that I brought up earlier, that hospitality chain, right? I'm bringing them up again because I think they're one of the forerunners here when we talk about really focusing on their content readiness with this AI and personalized future in mind that they're marching towards, and I think they've done a really good job at kind of leading the way here, and that I think many of the folks who are listening from other organizations can learn from. This particular hospitality chain went out to market and kind of started over from a content perspective, and they chose to actually to go with a omni-channel content platform as their solution, and they wanted one that could serve like we talked about, the right information to any relevant customer-facing channel. So it's true omni-channel personalization. So they needed a true omni-channel content platform. So they went out and they looked at the marketplace. We helped them through a pretty rigorous selection process. We looked at a whole myriad of different content solutions, and included in that was the high end of the DAM marketplace, the most sophisticated DAM vendors in the market. And of those many options out there, there was really a very small, I'd say less than a handful of vendors that truly qualified as something capable to deliver on this omni-channel content platform promise. But they didn't just think they were going to get the solution solely from a technology vendor. Where they did the real hard work is they created a graph model and associated their taxonomy structure with this graph model in a way that would allow them through a bunch of downstream platforms to traverse really key relationships in their organization, so that it would surface just the right information for just the right given context. This is a big effort, right? It was a mixture of finding the right technology, but also getting your house in order from a data and content perspective. Now, this is a multi-year journey, and they certainly haven't, solved every single challenge that they set out to. It'll continue to be a multi-year journey going forward. But so far, we've seen the payoff has proven substantial. The properties that exist within this organization, they can update local or site-specific information with confidence that the freshest information will show up in any context. They've started to develop personalized content variants that become available across different channels, like we're talking about. And maybe most importantly here, Tony, they decommissioned a really heavyweight and, to be quite honest, absurdly expensive web content management system that was, just built to cater to one single channel, and honestly, where so much of this information and that's so vital to this equation that was just trapped within this single system, and they were held hostage by this vendor for many years. So they swapped that out in favor of a much lighter and adaptable front end for their customer experience, knowing that they still had this foundation of core omni-channel content to pull from. So very different architectural model. And I think they started this journey before the AI tsunami. And I think what's really encouraging for them and us, if you think about it, is that they're better positioned than almost any of our other clients because they did this hard work, beforehand. There's so many organizations that are coming to this realization almost late to the game as they're being pushed, as you said, from that top-down part of the sandwich to do more with AI. They don't have their basics in order. They don't have the right technology to manage their content. They don't have their content structured and bolstered with intelligent metadata and the right taxonomic structure. So too often, most of our clients, I say, are realizing this too late. This particular example, they kind of fell into this in a way that they're way better off than their peers.
Yeah, and personalization was very much on their mind in doing this, but they knew, I think, that they were never going to be able to create all the personalization variants. So AI is now a big part of their strategy, and they can think about what's an effective way, particularly to do generative AI, but then also in terms of the way their vision was for these completely dynamically assembled experiences across all their different properties and environments, including their mobile apps. They're so much better set up for it to have AI, really personalize those experiences as well because of this work. So there's a real AI, story underneath this, and it's the marriage of AI and personalization built off that base. So Great. So we need to talk a little bit more about how vendors are evolving, and then make sure that we leave our wonderful listeners with some practical steps. But I think maybe we could just summarize, Jarrod, a kind of big picture view of what this ought to look like. Where it all starts at the bottom is foundation services around customer data, core content like Jarrod just talked about, analytics, having core logic and the governance around that core logic. And these are platforms that take a lot of work to implement, but you can mostly buy. But also at that bottom layer would be the context layer, which again I mentioned is around semantics, state, policy, governance, auditing, so forth. And so that together those are like the shared context. Then you've got the AI services, ideally in a loop that we talked about, Insights AI, Decisioning AI, Gen AI. It's kind of a mixed buy versus build story. So that's the second layer, the AI services. Then, the third layer up from the bottom would be an orchestration layer. So this is the control plane, coordinates all the treatment. You apply all the policies, the context and everything, and make things happen. This is still mostly a build story, but this is where the personalization happens, right? And so the build doesn't have to be terribly heavyweight because you've solved a lot of the problems already lower in your stack. But it is still mostly a build story. And then finally we get to local execution, and ideally this is a much lighter layer. So you've got your website, app, email, service environment, commerce, ads, mobile, what have you. That's still mostly a buy story. We think it's mostly a downshift story where the personalized experiences are executing there, but all of the intelligence and logic and content and data is coming from underneath. So that's really how personalization is going to work with AI in the future. It's not going to be the AI that you just turn on, within your web CMS, particularly if you're a larger enterprise. And that's really what we're talking about today, is mid-sized to larger enterprise. That's the future stack, Jarrod.
Yeah, and just a reminder to our Real Story Group members that are listening today, if you want a much cleaner visual of what Tony just described, feel free to reach out and we'll send you our working reference architectures that we've put in place. That was a good overview, Tony, but it still kind of begs the question of where the vendors are at. And, as well as I do at Real Story Group, this is what's core to our work. We're constantly watching the marketplace, looking at what the vendors can actually execute on so that we can advise our clients on which one would be the best fit for them. But I think what we found recently in our latest round of research is that there's kind of been some good news and some bad news. The good news is that some vendors are moving up the chain from features to starting to think about some basic use cases. So from generative AI to things like, how do I execute on supply chain automation and the like. But there's some bad news as well.
Yeah, so we wouldn't be Real Story Group if we didn't share the bad news as well, which is, we've identified now in our research kind of 10 use cases that we evaluate vendors against, and those fall into different categories, 4 different categories. We can talk about that another time in more detail, but there are, all of them bear to some extent on personalization, because again, personalization is where I think a lot of the effectiveness story is going to come out here. So we have use cases around, journey optimization, real-time personalization, lifecycle marketing and marketing automation, paid media optimization, those sort of things. But it depends on a number of other critical, obviously underlying services. So, so that's great. Vendors are kind of moving up from features to use cases, but what we're missing here from a vendor standpoint, and maybe this is inevitable, but what we're missing here, Jarrod, is we're not seeing like a vendor that will come out with like an end-to-end loop that we talked about. We're not seeing a vendor that says, look, we've cracked the code and can deliver, a context layer, the Insights AI, the Decisioning AI, the Generative AI, the data science learning loop, and tie it up all in a nice bow. And maybe we wouldn't want a vendor that does that. And so really, it's still going to be for us to put together an architecture around all of this. because at least at the enterprise tier, this is not an architecture you can buy. It's an architecture that you compose the way we've all been composing our MarTech stacks. And there will be some buy stories there, but we also have some integration work to do and some build work to do. And again, our thesis on all of this is that you can get lighter at the execution level, at the execution layer, and convert those resources, like that one company we worked with, into instead some of these centralized services that you need.
All right, let's close out with some real practical advice here. What should MarTech leaders be doing right now as it relates to personalization and AI?
Well, several things. Obviously, it's an ongoing process, and we acknowledge that many of you have a lot of legacy structures and systems that may be working, pretty decently for you right now. And obviously, you can't, completely start from scratch. So let's acknowledge that, and let's also acknowledge that many of you are still kind of at a pilot phase, which is not necessarily a bad thing. You want to make sure that you're learning from those pilots. Agentic pilots are particularly interesting in this regard because you end up learning a lot, and you need to be very careful about putting them into production. I think that if we look at this in terms of that 4-layer cake that I mentioned around shared context, then AI services on top of that, orchestration layer, and then local execution, we would have advice for things that you could start working on in 2026 at each layer. So if we start with a shared context, you definitely, from foundation services, you want to make sure that you are, if you haven't already, that you're building a really solid customer 360 store. You're developing some kind of content warehouse. That could be a logical warehouse. We have a whole episode on that. And then a context layer, which is really about building graphs and taxonomies the way that Jarrod described. If you haven't done that work, you're really going to need to do it. It's never too late to start it. And then with respect to the AI services layer, develop some use cases that build some muscle across insights, decisioning, and generative, as opposed to just focusing in particular just on generative, which is kind of a dead end if that's all you do. And then orchestration layer, where you're kind of orchestrating experiences. You might want to invest here in the context of agentic AI. Some of the agentic AI pilots that we see are internal, built with some internal tools. That's fine. Not a bad way to start and learn about it to improve maybe some workflows, where a lot of the longer term value will come, and it will take some maturity to get there, is going to be in using agents to compose experiences, personalized experiences for your customers. And then with respect to local execution environments, I think you really need to push your vendors, and certainly if you're replacing vendors, to focus on those that can adhere to and inherit remote services rather than forcing you to put in local content, local context, keep the data locally, manage the logic locally, and then you have this nice little localized personalization experience, which isn't going to work anymore. So again, happy to have a conversation with you about how all this plays out in your world, but just thinking about making improvements at all 4 layers of the stack, even in 2026, is a practical way to get started.
So on that very practical note, I'll give you an even more practical note, and I'll do that by reminding all of our listeners that at Real Story Group, we can help you and your team craft a business-focused AI strategy, with the right use cases, the right vendors, and above all, the right architecture that we've been talking about today to prepare you for the future. So if that's of interest to you, please don't hesitate to reach out to us in any way.
Okay, so next month, we're going to be doing some more future gazing. I know we've been doing this a lot, but it's so important, I think, to start from the end in mind and then build your way there, rather than just kind of feel our way to the future. There's a lot of feeling our way to the high future right now. And what we're going to offer next time is this idea about setting a North Star. So in our next conversation, we're going to talk about MarTech 2030. It's going to be a different world, potentially require a different stack. What does it look like? What is your North Star, and how do you get there? So it's going to be an ambitious discussion, but I think a really important discussion. Certainly we'll talk a lot more about AI and personalization then.
And I know, Tony, you've been thinking a lot about MarTech 2030. You've been doing a lot of work there, and I think we can tease to our listeners that you'll have a pretty exciting announcement as it relates to MarTech 2030 coming up in the next episode. So please come back and hear what that's all about next time. In the meantime, though, as always, we wanted to thank all of you for joining us. And if we encourage you, if you like what you heard on this episode or any episode, please feel free to like, subscribe, share with your friends. And as always, keep the feedback coming. You know, whether it's a comment on the YouTube page or on our iTunes or what other podcast page that you want, or on LinkedIn or an email directly to us. Feel free to keep the feedback coming. We love hearing from all of you. So with that, we'll close out now and just say thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Tony, and we'll see you next time on The Real Story for MarTech.
Thanks, Jarrod. See you all next time.